What's worse than being scared deep in the middle of the woods? Perhaps being lost deep in the middle of the woods. Perhaps even being lost, scared, and experiencing unexplained phenomenon in the middle of the woods. Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. It's good to see you made it back for another episode. Today we're going to be sharing stories from viewers just like you, who claim to have experienced some truly unexplainable things while out in the woods. If you have a story you would like to share, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that truly help keep this show going. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready to hear some stories that'll freak you out tonight. I grew up in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Have any of you ever heard of Zippo lighters? Yeah, they're from here. A forest surrounds the town along with most of the neighborhoods. My family lives sort of on the outskirts of Bradford. Of course, much like the town itself, our house was surrounded by thick forest. If you took in the scene from our back porch, you would see nothing but sprawling trees for miles. I tell you this so that you can gain a sense of isolation. You could scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would come to help you. This all started back in the summer of 1996. I was about 11 years old at the time. I had a childhood friend named Marty, who was the same age. Our fathers worked together, and he would come over almost every Friday to hang out. I remember it was cold out that night, and Marty and I found ourselves hiking through the trees, as we often did. We went a little further into the forest than usual. There was this barrier of trees that we would never go past, simply because I did not know the area beyond that point. But on this night, we both were feeling a bit daring and decided to continue past the barrier into uncharted territory. We eventually came upon a clearing. In the middle of this clearing was this old, disheveled-looking tent. Being the curious young men we were, we of course had to see what was inside. As we approached, I could feel the temperature around me drop. I am no stranger to the cold, but this was in the middle of the summer. Even at my young age, I could sense that there was something truly sinister inside this tent. A part of me was screaming to hightail it out of there, but my own curiosity had me in its grasp. We both stopped just outside the tent, and suddenly, we were both much too frightened to move any further. We were both frozen in place, staring at the tent's open entry flap as it swayed from side to side. The sky seemed to grow even dimmer since we discovered this tent, and though we were standing directly in front of the tent, we could not see inside. What happened next is the reason why I still struggle with alcoholism. A dark hand slowly emerged from the tent's opening. It reached out to us, with long, black nails protruding out from its fingertips. I am not ashamed to admit that I nearly peed myself out of fear. The hand slowly turned and made a beckoning gesture with its index finger, and that's when Marty and I heard a deep, bellowing laughter come from inside the tent. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I just remember me and Marty running for our lives, tearing through the trees and back to my house. I do have a vague memory of me briefly looking behind me as I ran, to see a tall, dark, inhuman figure standing just outside of the tent. Upon returning, Marty immediately called his mom to come pick him up. My mother asked us what was wrong, and we both explained what we saw in the forest. My mother ultimately dismissed our claim but led us in prayer while we waited for Marty's mother to come. Marty never ended up coming back over after that. and we sort of drifted apart. Sadly, Marty began hanging out with the wrong crowd and began doing hardcore drugs when we were around 14. He ended up hanging himself in his bedroom when he was 17. As for myself, I suffered from severe night terrors that tormented me for many years after that day in the woods. I would not get into what I would experience in my nightmares, but I will say that I became an alcoholic as a result. After moving far away and attending numerous AA meetings, I'm glad to say that I've managed to turn my life around. And I even have a family of my own now. I still visit Bradford every now and again to check in on my aging parents. Whenever I'm there, I always set flowers at Marty's grave. I am still convinced that what we saw in the woods that day contributed to his death. Now that I have some perspective, I think Marty and I encountered a demonic presence that day. It followed us home and proceeded to turn both of our lives upside down. There were rumors of people worshipping Satan out there in those woods around the mid to late 90s. Perhaps they awakened something, and Marty and I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the 80s growing up, we didn't have all the distractions that kids have today, so we had to make up our own things to do. Many times, this meant going outside, going hunting, or making up games. For our generation, our parents told us to be outside, but for us that lived in a small town, these activities were in abundance. There was one type of activity that almost everyone took part in, and this was riding some type of ATV or dirt bike. For me, this was one of my biggest pastimes when I was a child. When I was just 7 years old, a man on the highway was selling a YZ80. Now for me, this was an awesome sight. All I could think of was getting on that dirt bike and riding all day around where I lived. But my dad had other ideas. He thought I was much too young to have something so awesome. It took a few weeks of constant badgering for me to convince my dad to buy it for me, but in the end, my perseverance prevailed, and my dad bought it for me. I was so excited and could not contain myself. Now, I did not know how to ride a dirt bike at the time. The first time that I got on the machine, I popped the clutch, did a wheelie, and flipped the bike. Now, this did not inspire any confidence with my father. It took a little time, but I quickly got good at riding this badass machine. Luckily, I was able to use this open field to perfect my skill as a dirt bike rider. As my friends learned that I had a dirt bike, they started taking me around and showing me a few trails around my town. It slowly became one of our pastimes. We would do this almost every single day after school. It was one of my memories as a child that I really hold on to. There was one place that we went riding. This place was called Emmeline's. I never really knew the person or why it was called this, but there was an old, abandoned house way out in the middle of these woods. This old house had been out there for many years. It had a lot of good riding trails around it, from hills to creeks to wide open trails that you could really open your machine on. Most of the time, there were 2 or 3 of us that would go at the same time, but there were times that I would go out on my own. I had done these solo rides several times before this day. On this day, I could not go right after school. I had some homework from school that I could not get done at school, so I had to go home and get it done. I could not ride until everything was done, unfortunately, but I think most people know that. So it was later on in the day that I could take my daily ride. It was about 6 in the afternoon before I took off. Now, this was in the summertime, so it didn't usually get dark until around 8:30 or so. So I knew it would not be a very long ride because my dirt bike did not have any lights on it. I would have a few hours before I had to return home though. Emmeline's was only about 5 minutes from my house. As I got on my machine, I could not help but put a smile on my face. I absolutely love this thing. I love to be on my bike. After fueling up the machine and checking it over, I put it in neutral, kicked the bike, and started it up. Now, a few days before I had broken my clutch cable, so after starting it, I had to give it a push, jump on, and throw it into gear. This was no big deal, I had done it before. I got rather good at it. My dad had to order the cable and it had not come in quite yet. Off I went, as happy as a young boy could be on his dirt bike. I got to the trails and immediately jumped right in. I'd been ripping up the trails for about an hour and not seen anyone else on them. I guess everyone had better things to do on that day. In the middle of the woods was an open field. This field was about 4 or 5 acres big if I had to guess. It had a fence built up around it. The fence had been up for a long time. It was rusted and broken in quite a few places. But for the most part, it was intact and in decent shape. Like I said, I'd been riding hard for about an hour and had felt the call of nature. Since I had not seen anyone around, I decided to just stop on the trail and relieve myself. Now, I must mention that the dirt bike I had was a racing bike, so it did not have a kickstand, unfortunately. So, I had to stop and lean it against a fence post. As I was relieving myself, I noticed that it was very, very quiet. Now, I did not think too much about this, because I had been riding for about an hour straight. The dirt bike was pretty loud, so I just figured it was because of me. As I was going to the bathroom, I heard some rustling about 50 or 60 yards away from me. I looked that way and I did not see anything at first. So, I assumed that it was probably just a little squirrel, since they were everywhere out here. Finishing my business, I started to feel anxious for some reason. This heavy feeling came over me, like I was being watched. I looked all around me. But once again, I could see nothing. The bike was only a couple of feet away from me, so I started walking toward it. I took one step and heard something start walking behind me. I immediately turned around expecting to see one of my friends trying to sneak up on me. But, to my astonishment, there was absolutely no one there. Trying to shrug the experience off, I walked to my bike. But every step I took, I swear I heard one step behind me. By this time I was so scared, I did not know what I was going to do. Figuring the only thing I could do was run the few feet to my bike, jump on it, and take off. This had to be a seamless action though, since I did not have a clutch to take off with. I had to kickstart the bike, push it, and throw it into gear all in one motion, if I was going to get away from whatever was behind me. Gathering up all the courage and strength I had, I ran. Jumping on the bike, kick-starting it, and shoving it all at the same time was very hard. Somehow, while I was doing all of this, I never stopped hearing the footsteps behind me. I knew whatever it was only a few yards behind me. Once I was on my way, I felt a sudden breeze on my back, like something had made a swipe at me and just missed. This scared me even more and put more energy and urgency into me. As I slammed the bike into gear, I gave the bike all that it had. I was shifting gears and sliding around every corner like I was a professional. I looked back once and I could see the trees moving, but I was never able to see anything. Even though I did not see anything, it did not take away my sense of emergency to get out of those woods. Once I made it back to the road, I stopped, turned the bike off, and tried to gather myself. It took me a few minutes, but as I did I heard it. The most god-awful scream I had ever heard. It started out low, but by the time that it ended, it was so loud that I could feel it in my chest. I got that bike going and got home as fast as I could. It took me a long time before I went back into those woods, but when I did finally go back, it would always be with friends. This was a moment in my life that I will never forget. Hi, Swamp. I have an encounter I was a bit unsure whether to tell, because it's one that happens in the UK, and two, people probably are gonna call me crazy. My encounter was back in 2009, and has two parts, one in the summer and one in the early autumn if I'm remembering correctly. I am very clued up with the outdoors and live in a very rural community. I fish, camp, shoot, trap, and stay out at my lodge in the woods all the time when not at work. However, I am more careful and skittish about doing this since 2009 because of what I and my friend had happen to us. We were fishing for catfish over a 48-hour period in late summer of 2009. We booked out a lake in a forested area. I will not give away the locations due to certain reasons. This lake was only about 6 odd acres, but it was surrounded by a well-known forest with no roads or houses for at least 4 miles. We set up our bivvies, aka tents, on the side of the lake to get a better chance of being quiet, and we were not worried about being so far apart. There was no one else on this lake at all. It was just surrounded by forest, with a little dirt track leading back about 1,000 yards to another track. It was just starting to turn to sunset, and I was laying on my bed in the bivvy when my friend comes running over to my side. He was shaking and really unsettled, saying he was just in the woodline about 100 yards or so away from his bivvy, and he sees what he thought was a man watching him. Then he said it had like a fox head with pointy ears and glowing eyes. He was honestly really freaking out, and I just thought, okay, maybe he saw something. Maybe he was smoking something, I don't know. Although, at the back of my mind, I knew no one would be out there, so I grabbed my knife and he insisted I go look with him. When I got around to the side of his tent where he claimed this thing was, there was nothing. All I could see were broken branches and trees. He showed me where it was, and its head, and then we actually got to the spot it would have been. Apparently, this thing would have been like 6'9" or so. I again was ignoring his story, and he got frantic. He reeled in all of his rods and grabs a sleeping bag and comes over to my bivvy. He left all of his stuff, rods, bivvy, and slept in my bivvy until morning. This worried me, because by then, it had cost us a fortune to fish here, and he is careful with his money. Some would say he is, kind of tight. The next day he packed up and left, so I did too with a bit of doubt. I was a bit upset I could not finish the trip. He explained on the way home that he sees a 6-foot fox standing there watching him, and he was just really scared. I told everyone when I got home that this guy saw a 6-foot tall fox, apparently. Nobody really found it amusing, and nobody ever heard of such a thing. Fast forward to October of the same year. I booked the same location and got time off work to go back and fish that lake again with another friend, as I knew he would come. In fact, I knew I couldn't afford the venue on my own, so I needed a second man. I got down to the spot early 9 a.m. and set up for the 48-hour stay. My friend was meeting me after work, so I had all morning there on my own and had a peaceful time and caught a few carp. Around 2 p.m., I opened a beer and sat in my bivvy, looking across the lake at the woods my friend had seen that fox man, still giggling to myself. Well, by 3:30 p.m. I had another beer and a text came through from my phone. My friend saying he could not make it, his family member was in the hospital. I tried my best to call him and make sure everything was okay, but the signal was hit or miss out here, so it never really connected. I thought nothing more of it and knew he could call me later in the week. It was about 4 or 5 p.m., and I was the only person out here with nothing to do but fish. So I started cutting up the cans of Spam I had and pellets, throwing in my bait to see if I could catch anything. I left the remainder of my halibut pellets and Spam around the back of my bivvy, under a small tarp. I went into the bivvy and settled in around 8 or 9 p.m. after no other fish biting. I was awoken roughly at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning by a loud thumping noise running around the side of the lake from the forest. It sounded like a small horse galloping around the side of my lake. I laid there frozen stiff as it approached my bivvy, slowing itself down to a stop a little bit away from my bivvy. It was breathing deep inhales and loud exhales with gobbling grunt noises. It must have weighed more than a man as I heard it going around my bivvy in circles, changing direction from time to time. It then inhaled deep and sounded like it went on two legs and pressed its face on the side of my bivvy ceiling. It was dark, but the impression it gave off was that of a German Shepherd. It then dropped down with a thud and started to eat all of my Spam and trout pellets. The sound of it eating was like that of a starving dog slapping its lips and grunting. I just laid there stiff, not moving. Once it finished, it took a massive inhale sniff of the wall of my bivvy and exhaled out with a low, deep growl. I could honestly have gotten up and bolted, but my body wouldn't move. As quickly as it came, it went running back off around the lake, smashing through branches and sounding like a racehorse. I laterally laid there till morning with my knife out, and thank God I had my bivvy door closed. I got up just as it got light out, packed up my van, threw all my stuff in it, and got the heck out of there. I still go out in the woods, but mainly to my lodge I built on my 25-acre wood that has a good 10 miles away from that location. But honestly, even then, I always keep my gun on me. What you are about to read is a warning. I beg you. In fact, I implore you, please, do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages, so trust me when I say that something has been hanging out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer, southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry. A call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet, as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I could not hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter. Everything seemed to be still. This made me nervous for multiple reasons. One being animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers and are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. 2. Areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly silent and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass by them. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car, when something peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point I have been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It is far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I knew those woods very well. But some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I had managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try to massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me, and I cannot understate how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I had been visiting all my life, only for it to utterly be foreign to me out of nowhere. I had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try to get a bearing of where I was headed, but to my surprise the needle just kept moving around erratically. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight, so that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky, the moss in this area grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it is not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm and told myself there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring. I walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I never, ever seen in those woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was quite frankly terrifying. In all the years I had spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I had never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979. So just how I and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door and see if anyone was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer to the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I am not entirely sure, but for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I actually brang myself to put my fist to the door, I felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back." When I finally knocked, the door cranked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks were on that door had long since been worn away. The inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order of the furniture that led me to believe that every so often the cabin did receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. I saw something that I don't know how to describe. Quite frankly, all I know is it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statuette sat atop of a stone altar. I appreciate this is intentionally confusing to read. I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack right then and there. Do not ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child outside of that cabin and into the night. The night, you read that right. When I walked into the cabin, it was still daylight. I could not have been there for more than a couple of minutes at least. That's what it felt like anyway. Only when I burst through that wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back home. I have not been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a buddy of mine once that I go hunting with, but the words just would not seem to come out. But please, if you're sharing this, heed my warning. Do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. This took place when I was 14 years old, camping in a little area of land in western Maryland where lots of my mom's family had small cabins. This was in the middle of nowhere on private property, and everyone on the mountain was related to us one way or another. We grew up spending summers around the campfire, telling scary stories and running around the woods. A quick explanation of layout. Imagine a large capital T for a road. Above the T by 150 feet or so ran Savage River. If you went left on the T, it would take you past multiple family houses, but also a dense forest that cut the road off. If you went all the way to the right of the T, this is where my mom's tiny cabin was, and this is where we stayed. I often went off on my own, preferring it that way. I was about to do that when my aunt had asked me to tag along. She is 14 years older than I am and a big child. She had pink hair at the time, was covered in tattoos, and is almost 6 foot tall, so not an easily intimidated woman. So I had decided that we would go all the way to the left into the dense forest, and she was fine with that, admitting she'd come with me so she could have a smoke and keep out of eyesight of my disapproving grandmother. Now, I was a good kid, and even though she offered me a hit, the thought of drugs still scared me at the time, so I declined. From the end of the road was a super rough dirt path into the woods, with the river still running 150 feet above the path. If you were to still walk towards the river, it goes down a downward slope. A few miles in, you will come across one of those legendary random staircases that lead to nowhere. On this particular day, I had taken the dirt path and walked down the 150 feet along the river, watching the fish and crawdads scurry by as my aunt got high as a kite, a little bit behind me. I was in my own little world when I suddenly heard a clicking noise that brought me back to reality. I looked up and around confused, then my eyes landed on a man I had never seen before. Standing across the river no more than 15 feet away from me, he must have walked out of the woods on the other side of the river. It's summer, but he is in a black jacket and raggedy jeans, and is holding one of those cheap, non-digital yellow cameras that you would roll the top, make it click, and then take a picture. I was stunned, because I had never seen anyone other than my family anywhere around the area in all of these years I had been coming up here. He smiled at me, then slightly lowering his camera. He was older, probably in his 40s, and very scruffy. He was tall and kind of thin, gaunt even. He takes a step forward, and I in turn take a step back. He scrolls the top of the camera and points it directly at me again. I am literally at a loss for words and can only manage to take another step back, almost slipping on a rock as I do. That is when my aunt stumbles through the trees and is in mid-sentence about how much she missed being high when she stopped and stared at the man. I was just staring at her at this point, frozen, like a deer in headlights. I slowly turn, and he is not looking at my aunt. He is staring right at me. He clicks the camera again at us, and then he does something that makes my blood run cold and turns the situation from weird to terrifying. He does that tut-tut-tut thing with his finger and points to what looks like a knife sheathed and strapped to his hip. He then points a finger that he slices across his throat. That is the moment I went into autopilot. I spun around and began barreling through the trees, grabbing onto my aunt. My heart pounded as I ran, though I could have sworn I heard one more click before I could hear the splashing from behind me. I almost collapsed because my legs felt like jelly. The river is deep in parts, but where I had been, we were at a point where the water would have been only thigh deep to a grown man. I tore upwards and ran blindly like a rabbit from a fox. When we saw the stairs, my aunt quickly yanked me to the other side and slid down beside me as we caught our breath. I was wheezing so loud I had to cover my mouth to try to muffle the sound. I peered around the trees, but they are so dense I could not see the river from the stairs. But even with my hammering heartbeat, I could hear the snapping of branches like someone was barreling through the forest. Now, I am very scared at this point. It is not an easy straight trail back into my family property. You must weave around, and in spots, it dips and gets rocky, so you must do a lot of S-type shapes. There are random rocks everywhere, and it would be so easy to twist an ankle or smack into a tree in my panic. Not to mention, we always tread carefully and look where we're going because there are so many snakes in the area. I am sobbing and wheezing badly, and we had another few miles until we were even remotely close to my family's property. My mind is racing, but I know we cannot stay. Neither of us had any type of weapon, and staying was making it harder for me to convince myself to run, as paralyzing terror crept in. My legs and arms are already cut up, and before I can decide what to do, my aunt pulls me towards the T road, desperately just stumbling and running. I do not make it more than another mile until I misstep and trip over a branch, tripping and smacking headfirst into a tree. I crumble over and taste blood. I had bitten through my lip in the fall. I am dazed, but my adrenaline is still pumping, so I scramble to a tree as my aunt turns and notices I am not right behind her. She scrambles back and drops to her knees in front of me, whispering. I am dazed, but she keeps repeating that we need to keep going. I am shaking so bad, I do not think I can walk any further, much less run. I have probably another 1.5 miles until I am on my family's property, but another 2 until we are at an occupied cabin. My ears are ringing, and I am hardly paying attention to my aunt's frantic pleas. I completely psych myself out again and keep looking behind me, but I just don't see anything. She decides that she is not going to waste any more time because of stupid me, and drags me up and forward. I hobble forward as quickly as I can as she continues to pull me too quickly. The rest is a blur until we break through the woods. Most of my family was not there at the time, so we only stop when we make it to my grandmother's, and I just run, sobbing. No one locks their doors around there, and my grandmother takes one horrified look at me and my aunt, who is equally cut up and scared, looking and yells for my grandfather, who promptly takes over and grabs his rifle. I cannot put into sentences what just happened, so my aunt takes over, leaving out the part about her being high as a kite, of course. She and my grandmother go cabin to cabin, gathering the men and their guns, as well as warning the women and children about what just happened. There is no signal up there, so calling the sheriff was just not an option, and to get up the mountain if they left immediately would take over an hour. It is getting dark, and the roads leading up to the property are so windy and steep that you would have to be out of your mind to try and drive up there in the dark anyway. My mom eventually got word and came over. She took one look at me and my aunt and said I had probably just gotten high with her, which in turn made us overly paranoid, and when we saw the random fisherman who was trespassing, we jumped to conclusions and probably startled him as much as he startled us. She continued by saying I probably just imagined that he was taking my picture or that he began chasing us, though my aunt had been the one to repeatedly retell the story. My aunt stood up and yelled at my mother, saying that I was a good kid and did not do anything, and we were telling the truth. They began screaming at each other and my grandmother made them both stop, telling them both to grow up. Even with the men of my family scouring the woods, they never saw any sign of the man we had encountered in the woods. Everyone on the mountain locked their doors at night though, for the first time in a long time. And to this day, all I can wonder was, what was happening? Did I end up being a part of some creepy picture collection? But considering what could have happened, maybe if I had been alone like normal, I wouldn't be here right now. Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright unexplainable stories from the woods, sent in by viewers just like you. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it be a story from the woods or something else entirely, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamps. It's stories like yours to help keep this show going. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button. The more people that hit that like button, the more YouTube promotes it in its algorithm, and that helps me out a ton. If you're on iTunes, Spotify, or any other podcast platform, leave me a review. It really helps as well. If you guys are new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you're not on YouTube and you don't have data, you can download and bring your favorite scary stories from the swamp anywhere you go by using iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about anywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. If you want to support the swamp outside of hitting that like button and subscribing, be sure to check out the merch store. I've got face masks, shirts, mugs, hoodies, and just about everything else you could want. Now that we made it all the way to the end, I'd love to know how many of you listened to the end. Comment down below, backflipping Sasquatch, to let me know that you made it to the end, and to maybe confuse a few people. Thank you guys, as always, for the support. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.